I think today we'll start by talking about why the Transcendentalists should be considered at all. They're hardly a popular subject these days, and they're one of the most ignored parts of American history. To discuss them historically is a less interesting thing than to try to understand what they mean to us today, what we can learn from them, what we can apply. And the main focus of the lecture will be not so much in detailing what happened when and to whom, as in trying to present to you the ideas that these people had, their reasons for the things that they did, and how these things apply to us. New England Transcendentalism seems to pop out of the American soil from nowhere, and it seems to die very quickly after blossoming. I don't think that that's actually a valid observation, however. There's a tendency to look into the past through the lens of a very successful financial and industrial period that America is arguably coming out of today. And this period led to a lot of justification of a very economically aggressive kind of lifestyle. The idea that one should do what one wishes to do, and that this is a land where one can be tremendously successful and ruthless, and that this is the pioneer sentiment, and this is what makes America great, that sort of thing. Well, Transcendentalists tend to fade away in that kind of a philosophy, as they in some ways can be bent to supporting it, but in most ways disagree with it soundly. When America was born, perhaps the single most important voice was that of Thomas Paine. He might be described as the mind of the Revolution and the Constitution. He was the first to really articulate the ideas of freedom in religion and politics. He was tremendously ahead of his contemporaries in his vision of the world and of how things should be. And he was quite practical in ways of suggesting how this change should take place. Now, we can draw two developments from Thomas Paine. The first one to take root, and the one which we are all most familiar with, was the American Revolution itself. And in our schools, that is the one that is most often referred to, and he is usually considered a father of the Revolution. But there is certainly another child that Thomas Paine fathered, and that would be Transcendentalism. It took quite a long time to take root and develop, but eventually in New England, a small group, Unitarians, who decided that their religion was in some ways restrictive, in some ways needed development, came up with a new philosophy of life, a love of freedom and of liberty and of the country that is definitely foreshadowed in Thomas Paine's work. Now, Emerson was always fond of pointing out that great geniuses seem to just pop out of the soil, and we always stand before them in awe, wondering how they might have been developed. But when one begins to study their histories, suddenly things become clear, and suddenly it becomes a logical progression as a spark of inspiration is passed from one mind to another, and we can draw a line sinking far back almost into prehistory of these individuals who influence one another. There doesn't seem to be any spontaneous genius erupting here and there. It seems to be that there are influences on key individuals, and these people then develop in the public eye. And the same thing can be said of Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism as a movement, and it can be said of each individual in the movement. Emerson, Thoreau, Alcott, these individuals seem to pop out of the American soil with no precedent. In fact, there was a great deal of precedent. And in fact, it was a precedent that was taken from all different parts of the world. And later we'll stress the importance of that, because this in itself is a symbol of the American vision and the American responsibility, that this was not a philosophy indigenous to this country, but was developed out of Europe, out of Asia, out of this country, out of almost every corner of the world. Where to begin? We should probably begin with the Hindu philosophers, whom Thoreau, Alcott, and Emerson were very well read in. All three of them were great admirers of the Bhagavad Gita. All three of them voraciously read whatever new translations of Hindu literature happened to come out, and all had the highest praise to give for Hindu thought. Another source was Platonism. All of the three of them, and most of the other members of the Transcendental movement, were very well read in the Platonic authors, in Plato himself and the Neoplatonists, particularly in Thomas Taylor's translations of these, which were particularly metaphysical and particularly inspirational. Another source was a German transcendental movement, Kant, Fichte, Jacobi. These men were very deeply read. Some of them approached a kind of Neoplatonic philosophy on their own, developed out of Kant's observations, and indeed the name Transcendentalism was adopted from Kant's philosophy. There was a feeling among the Transcendentalists that by his deep analysis of the human mind, he had freed humanity of ignorance, and that now a new system of thought and freedom could be developed from the foundation which he established. Another great influence was, of course, Christianity. Almost everyone involved in the movement had been Unitarian or involved in some sort of a New England Christianity, and all of them were, to differing levels, believers in Jesus as a teacher and example. Emerson got in quite a bit of trouble when he tried to say that Jesus was just that, a teacher and example, as opposed to Son of God. There's a famous address that he gave to a divinity school in which he argues that we are all sons of God. You can imagine this was not very popular with his audience. Another influence, and perhaps one that is the most neglected, was something that was in the air and in the land at the time. Something that Emerson and Thoreau and Alcott may not themselves have been that much aware of. And that was the history of this land, of this country. 50, 60, how many tens of thousands of years the Indians lived, breathed, died in this land. Their blood in the soil, their bones decaying in it. The Americans come from Europe, they come from Asia. They're very young, they've been here for 200-300 years at the most. There are tens of thousands of years of this influence in the air and in the land, in the trees. And in the writings of Thoreau and Emerson in particular, we find this Indian approach to life breathing in full force. These were individuals who were not interested in logical systems. Emerson is a very frustrating writer to someone who wishes to systematize him. He contradicts himself. He will tell you in his writings to speak the truth now, as it looks to you now. And if tomorrow you speak the truth and it contradicts what you said yesterday, fine. That is the way it will be. Man was not interested in appearing to be wise or logical in thought. Thoreau, another one, who wrote about the land, about the feelings the land inspired in him, about the beauty of it. He found lessons in the shapes of trees, in the movement of the waters. It's, again, a very Indian kind of an approach. It could be argued that quite a bit of American mysticism, of whatever sort it takes, is based on a kind of Indian approach to things. Now, what do we mean by an Indian approach to things? The Indian perhaps differs from the Aryan most in this one thing, that the Aryan is quite given to religious beliefs that have to do with faith, with holy books, with belief in a text, with the idea that once long ago a dispensation was given to man, and that living according to this dispensation, one can be good and achieve some sort of heavenly reward. The Indian does not and has never understood that kind of philosophy. The Indian is much more interested in what he himself has experienced. The Indian will go out and sit in vigil on a mountaintop and fast and have visions. The Indian will watch what sorts of things happen when he has certain sorts of actions. The Indian will look at the land and learn from that. And these are the authority for the Indians' beliefs. To believe in a holy book makes no sense to them. They don't understand how the experience of another can speak to us. This is exactly the approach of an Emerson, of an Alcott, of a Thoreau. Emerson read all of the holy books and had great things to say about them. He felt that they were tremendously important, that they educated, that they inspired. He said that a book of that nature should be used as a means of support when one feels one's own resolve crumbling, when there is doubt. One can pick up one of these books and be reminded that others have thought this way, that others have had these feelings. One can learn and one can be inspired. However, Emerson and Thoreau would not name any single book as authority. They would not name any single religion. When they began to publish their magazine, The Dial, under the editorship of Margaret Fuller, one of the things that Fuller particularly pointed out was that she would never make the magazine dogmatic, that the Transcendental movement must never have any sort of dogma, that rather than being a particular kind of philosophy that had to be adhered to in an exact way, it should rather be a state of mind, a feeling of openness, a kind of inspired regard for the world and for the opinions of others, finding truth in what one sees and hears, but never designating truth by logic, rather feeling it and understanding its presence. Now that influence has perhaps been the greatest help for the American Indian in survival. It was interesting that in spite of the great problems and in spite of the horrible hardship which they went through, that there are still powerful Indian mystical movements that, on the whole, the greater tribes, the Hopi and such, have maintained their religious traditions. And in fact, these traditions are growing stronger now and are spreading to the Anglos. Emerson and Thoreau had an acute sensitivity for the land. They loved the beauty of this country. Emerson toured the nation. He walked in Yosemite with John Muir when he was quite an old man. He took a train ride across the continent. He was always dazzled by what nature had given to us, by the good fortune of every American to live in a country so rich with resources, so beautiful that every turn of a road presented a new picture for inspiration. He never tired of comparing mystical, philosophical, emotional experience to the heads of corn waving in the wind, to the look of the sun as it rises, to the placid lake. He felt that in America there was an endless richness of example, a source of calm and inspiration. Now, this is perhaps the first point at which we can draw a conclusion, or at least a suggestion for ourselves, in that there is a tendency in modern society to appreciate the beauty of the country in two ways that are arguably less functional than Emerson's way. The first is to appreciate how much money we can make out of using the resources in it. And the second way is to appreciate how good it looks in our photographs. I'm sure we've all seen the tourist who sees nothing but what he sees through his camera lens and is so busy taking pictures of it so he'll remember that he virtually has no experience of where he is at the moment, except fumbling with the camera a little bit. The argument from the Transcendentalists would probably have been rather to enjoy it at the moment, not to clutter oneself up with the cameras and with these sorts of accoutrements, but rather to be present at that moment and breathe in the beauty of the landscape and simply be affected by it, commune with it, think about it a little bit, feel. In this way, the kind of learning, the kind of memory that is brought back is so much richer than a mere photograph. It's something that's built into us that we carry with us from that day forward. Now, earlier, it was mentioned that the fact that so much of this philosophy was taken from all across the world was an important thing. I will add to the areas we've already discussed that we may also add the Jewish scriptures, we may add the Persian scriptures, we may add the Islamic scriptures. All of these were read. The Islamic poets, the Sufis, the Hermetic writers of Europe, Jacob Boehme, the mystics of Germany, Swedenborg, all of these were read by the Transcendentalists who had a voracious appetite for this kind of literature. And it's one of the amusing and lovable things about Emerson that he's continually railing in his essays about not reading so much, because when you read, you're wasting your time. You should be doing instead of reading what others are doing. And of course, Emerson had a huge library and was constantly reading. This country has a particular responsibility that is so painfully apparent that we normally absolutely forget about it. We tend to trip right over it. For most of recorded history, the human race has distinguished itself with the blatant stupidity of thinking that the only way to safeguard themselves and to keep civilization at its height was to preserve racial, creedal purity. The French must be French and the Germans must be Germans, and there can be no mixture because it weakens the two. America was a tremendous experiment. America represented the melting pot. Suddenly, all of these different races and creeds were mixed. Different nations were mixed. And one can imagine the quiet eyes of the world wondering what would happen. Would we all kill each other off in the first 100 years? What would happen? Well, America has proven something, because in the shortest amount of time in the history of the world, America has emerged as the most powerful and important country in the world. Now, that position may be somewhat in question today, but nevertheless, the important fact of it is that America accomplished this in just over 200 years, an unbelievable feat. Now, when we attempt to understand how this could be, we can draw several conclusions. We can say, well, we had this great mass of land. We can say, well, that the immigrants were a very pioneer stock of people. But there are arguments against both of these. There are other areas of land that are easily as rich as America, or were, and there have been bad things to say about pioneer stock as well as good. Perhaps the best way to explain it would be to say that so much talent, so many different beliefs, so many different kinds of people mixed here, that the possibilities of what could be done multiplied vastly beyond what could be done in a, quote, racially pure sort of a climate. If there was any question of this, then the great debacle, the great example also of World War II should have put it to rest. World War II becomes a tremendous illustration of this, as the last great bulwark of the idea of racial purity is destroyed by a confederated world, by French fighting alongside of British, by Hindus, by Australians, by Africans, by Americans. And it is perhaps a great, great symbol that the war ended when America entered. This responsibility is so much more important, this responsibility of example, is so much more important than the differences between all of us, and the petty sorts of prejudices that we develop. And we have fights over water rights in New Mexico between Spanish and Indians. There's very little consideration of what kind of good things have come from the mixture of Spanish and Indians. There's a tendency to fall into the pattern of day-to-day tension and nervousness, and we tend to get blinded by these details and forget that these greater realities are truly the more important, not only because they affect more people, but also because they represent the great trends that are moving at any time in the history of the world. The great trend of America is certainly that of brotherhood. It's certainly an example that different races and creeds can live together and not only survive, but be very successful, to the point that they can be almost suicidal, as we have been, They can be so aggressive and short-sighted that they can virtually pollute everything around them. They can threaten their very existence and yet survive and yet have a good quality of life and freedom. Now, one can easily imagine that we teleport Emerson or Thoreau here and we explain to them what the world is like today, and one would probably imagine that they would be horribly depressed and want to return immediately back to where they were. I don't think that's true. I think that a person like Emerson or a person like Thoreau would see these greater movements and would be thrilled by what is happening. Perhaps the nuclear crisis would not be seen as some insurmountable problem that hangs over our heads, but rather that for the very first time in the development of man, man has created his own problem to grow from, rather than having to suffer some horrendous natural disaster to wake him up from his stupor. Perhaps the next step will be that we will not have to create the problem at all, that we will be able to simply understand what the next step is and then continue. It can be a source of great comfort in this time to realize that when we create a problem, we can solve it. Any problem you can think of, you can solve. You were the one who thought it up, you can solve it. Well, the human race has thought up the nuclear situation, and the human race can certainly solve it. Simply a question of becoming a little bit motivated, using a little bit of imagination, being a little bit positive instead of negative, and drawing on the endless source of inspiration which the Transcendentalists devoted their lives to portraying and exalting. Perhaps the most important aspect of the Transcendental philosophy was this passion, this understanding of man's limitless potential. Emerson had once said that there was no bar of separation between God and the individual man, that there was a great connection, and that man could rise as high as his desire and his self-discipline and his love and understanding took him. Now, with that rising and with all the abstract ideas of union with God and holiness comes something that is not usually considered, which is a tremendous energy that one is able to draw on in that kind of activity. When we look at the life of Emerson, we see a man who lectured constantly into old age, who traveled constantly, who wrote stacks of work, notes, diaries, lectures, books, all sorts of things. A never-ending source of inspiration was this communion that he had with what he called his overself, his higher being, the true Emerson, the true human inside all of us. Now, why do we lose touch with that, is the question. One of the great arguments against Transcendentalism has always been that it doesn't make sense. It isn't common sense. If we are really connected, why aren't we connected all the time? Why aren't we aware of it? Why are there a few madmen running around saying that we are, while the rest of we practical people can't possibly get in touch with this thing? Well, Emerson also discussed that. We have a tendency to become so fascinated and so hypnotized with the things that are around us, with little problems, with little annoyances, with little things that we see, with things we have to remember. All these sort of things fascinate us. And if one took a moment to consider the tremendous amount of energy that we spend each moment on these ridiculous trifles, we begin to understand just what we're capable of. Imagine being able to conserve your energy. Imagine being able to cut back from these petty little concerns, from worrying about what one should make for dinner, will we be late, worrying about the traffic, worrying about the guy who cut you off in traffic, worrying about all these small, petty things that we spend energy on. Suddenly, there's a great resource of energy available to you. Suddenly, things can be done that one couldn't dream of in other circumstances. That is the kind of energy that will have to be tapped to cure the world's ills at this time, because that energy is also involved with creativity. It is also involved with positivity. It is involved with all of the things that occasionally will enter into history through the vessels of a few individuals who become leaders like Emerson and Thoreau, and suddenly, well, give a good kick in the rear end of everyone around, reminding them who they are, reminding them of their capabilities, not letting them sit quietly in the corner and whine about how miserable things are, but saying, it is your own fault. You have put yourself here, and you have the capability of getting yourself out now, and you always have. Now, I think we should discuss a little bit who these people were so that we don't get some sort of an inflated image of Emerson and Thoreau as our prophets of today, I think, which they would have both found very disgusting. Emerson was training at Harvard to be a preacher. He was going to be a Unitarian minister. And he never tired of pointing out how badly he did at Harvard, and also that the books that he tended to read under benches, hiding from his teachers, had much more influence on him than the books that he read in class. Those were the things that he remembered, and those were the things that eventually convinced him of what his destiny would be. However, upon graduation from Harvard, Emerson was still considering the life of a minister, and in fact was about to be ordained, actually was ordained, and then began to give really lousy lectures at church. These are really something to read. They're quite amazing. He fell in love and married, madly in love with this woman, who then died. And this was the beginning of the Emerson that we know now. He was tremendously hurt, crushed by this event. He could not deal with it on the basis of his Christianity. He had to begin searching for something inside himself that would support this experience. He traveled to meet people like Carlyle and Coleridge in England, who had been bringing the Hindu and the German philosophies into America and into England. His remark on returning from there, on his long ship voyage, was that he learned that no one would give him the answer but himself, that no Carlyle, no Coleridge had the answers, that he, Emerson, would have to find them. At the same time, he began working on his first book, Nature, which is a very beautiful work and is arguably one of his finest. Then we have the popular career of Emerson that most of us know somewhat about, a lecturer, an important force in social change, a great humanitarian. Now, springing around the same area of New England and becoming involved with him were other great minds who had a tremendous influence on Emerson. They included Bronson Alcott, who is a favorite scapegoat of American historians because he was somewhat strange. That has to be admitted. Bronson Alcott had wonderful ideas about education, many of which have been used and are being used today in the school systems. He was a reformer in education. His idea was, as a good Platonist should believe, that all the knowledge was already inside your heads. The problem was helping you to bring it out. So rather than making one memorize and drawing diagrams on the wall, Emerson inspired Alcott to open a school where he would ask questions. And these questions, these conversations with the children, make fascinating reading. There have been some arguments that the children fed back to Alcott what he wanted to hear, this sort of thing, but upon reading the conversations, this doesn't seem very likely. Some of the answers to theological questions are startling that these children provide. Alcott's idea was, if I can get answers about these questions from children who are unaffected by dogma, then I will know if what is said is true. Oddly enough, most of it was. The children tended to agree with what was in Holy Scripture, and they took to it very readily. Their parents, however, did not. Alcott was very unpopular. He was constantly in trouble, and he seemed to relish in it. He found poverty just no problem at all, even though his poor children and wife did suffer for it. He was blissfully unaware of what was happening around him most of the time. He wrote what he called Orphic sayings, which in some ways are inspirational, in some ways are extremely difficult to make out. He used a very strange kind of language. And these became the butt of every reporter in America. There was endless good humor at making these Orphic sayings into such things as gastronomic sayings and sayings about all sorts of less exalted experience. Alcott was basically unaffected, really didn't care too much about this criticism, which did, however, hurt the other Transcendentalists. Emerson's remark upon seeing the Orphic sayings before they were printed in the Dial was, "I don't like these, you won't like them either, but we'll publish them." He seemed to know what was going to happen. Now, Alcott also tried experiments in communal living that tended to be somewhat disastrous. He was much too much of an idealist and much too much of a believer in essential human goodness to realize that sometimes the essential human goodness is cloaked in a lot of less good behavior. And there was a tendency for his projects to fall through, at which time Emerson came swooping in and would save him with a place to stay and a little bit of food and some money and that sort of thing. Alcott was, however, a great source of inspiration to Emerson. And in the Nature Address, one hears Emerson speak of his Orphic poet and then quotes in detail from a diary. And this is Alcott's diary from which he is quoting. Another figure of the period was Thoreau. Now, Thoreau it has to be argued whether he should be considered a transcendentalist. He's rather in his own category. He was somewhat Emerson's protege, at least from Emerson's standpoint. From Thoreau's, it may have been a question of practicality. It was a really nice thing to have a very well-known, wealthy, popular writer who agreed with your own feelings, supporting you and giving you an outlet for your work. Thoreau was not a popular writer during his life. Walden was not an important book when it came out. He would sometimes write poetry, which he admitted wasn't very good, and he would write these nature excursions, things like Walden, and had a great deal of pleasure out of himself and really didn't care too much if anybody else read it. He made a living as a surveyor. This was his backbone activity that allowed him to do whatever he wanted. And then in 1845, Thoreau went to live on Walden Pond to see if he could live without other people, if he could build his own house, if he could feed himself, if he could find water. The experiment not only produced a wonderful book, but produced some pretty wonderful effects in the man that are not so much known. It is very... St. Francis of Assisi is often pointed to as the great animal lover and the one who the animals responded to so beautifully, but it may be that our own Thoreau actually surpassed St. Francis in this. As there are records, we know that fish came to Thoreau, wild fish. When he would put his hand out, they would swim to his hand. That deer and all manner of wild animals came to him. That birds would alight on him. This all during the Walden period. Obviously, he had become so in touch with nature that nature had no fear of him. Thoreau left perhaps his greatest lesson about his belief and about the transcendental movement itself on his deathbed. As he lay dying, we must remember this was not a successful individual. This was not a man who had lectured across the world and who had many books written and who could look back on a great life of service. This was a man who lived as a surveyor and written some nice books and published a few articles and had some arguments with Emerson and this sort of thing. As he lay on his deathbed, one of his more enthusiastic Christian friends came to him, bent over and whispered in his ear and said, "Have you made your peace with God?" Thoreau smiled and said, "I never knew that we had argued." Now, another important character of the time, especially important to today, was Margaret Fuller. We have our popular idols of feminism. She is not usually included among them. But in fact, Margaret Fuller probably had the best intellect of any woman in the history of the United States. She was a superb critic. She was highly respected by every member of the Transcendentalist movement, by the German philosophers. She was a woman who was pointed to consistently as an example of what learning and what endeavor could do. The idea that there was any difference between men and women was absolutely destroyed by her example. She became rather a young matriarch to the Transcendentalist movement. Emerson selected her to be editor of the Dial, the organ, the magazine of the movement. And she was usually the one to whom the different writers would take their work to have it criticized. They respected her criticism above everyone else's, and when Alcott and Emerson wrote a biography of her, they continually mentioned this point, that her fine sensitivity and her excellent mind were able to penetrate into a work of sculpture, into a work of fiction, into a work of philosophy equally. She translated many of the German Transcendentalist philosophers, and her translations are still respected today. The way she became the example that she was may not be such a good allegory for us to follow, in that her father subjected her to an incredible amount of study and work when she was a child, to the point that she almost broke down. However, it caught on when she was a teenager, and suddenly she developed a great love for reading. And this never left her for the rest of her life. When she was 22 years old, Margaret Fuller wrote that she could not accept any established dogmatic religion, that she had two beliefs, and those two beliefs were what she would build her life around. The first was that there is a God who is the greatest level of perfection and beauty imaginable. And her second belief was that all life is a progression to union with that pinnacle of beauty and perfection. 22 years old. I think about that one. She continued to be honest to these beliefs the rest of her life. Her writings always presented that sort of a belief, and she only met with the idea of settling down into a more usual kind of religious approach with abject depression. She would write sometimes that someday she expected, when she was an old woman, that she would quiet down and become a good Unitarian or something of the sort, and that the prospect of it filled her with depression. But she hoped that by then she'd be able to accept it graciously. Well, as things worked out, she did not have to do that. She went off and married a marquis in Italy, had a child, became involved in the Italian wars, the revolution there, served quite valiantly, and then on her way back home to America to spread the news of Italian freedom and to become an apostle of freedom here, died with her husband and child in a shipwreck. Emerson sadly writes about that it was perhaps a good thing that it happened. The reason that he writes that ties into the end of the Transcendental movement as it appeared at that time. Transcendentalism was like a beautiful cactus flower with a magnificent scent and beautiful colors that blooms one night and then dies. It had a tremendous effect for a short while and then began to fall away. Now, what caused it to fall away? Well, there was a tremendous economic revolution. Industrialism exploded. Suddenly there was just too much to do. There was too much activity, too much money to make, and too many things to accomplish to really be concerned with this kind of Emerson pseudo-mysticism, as they would call it. Also, a new movement in philosophy developed in Hegel, who was translated and brought to this country and who inspired many of the American thinkers because he presented a much more logical approach to things. He was a philosopher and not a mystic. And in this sense, many of the philosophers who had accepted Emerson because he was the closest thing they could get shifted over to Hegel. Emerson was aware of this. He spent a very genteel old age. He was a great relic of American affection for its heroes. and was respected till the day that he died. He met the presidents and could still lecture to a large audience. He became quite forgetful as he got old and would often complain that he wasn't quite sure what he had said in his lecture, but no one seemed to mind, and that bothered him most of all, that they seemed to be much more happy with just looking at him and not with listening to what he had to say. With the passing of Emerson, the Transcendentalist movement can be said to close as an historical event. The question is, does it close permanently? Of course, we can point out that Emerson's essays still sell well, and that Thoreau's Walden is still a great book, and that there are many people who are very much influenced by them. But I think there's something more important at work today. Around the turn of the century, just a few decades after the death of Emerson, Yeats wrote a poem called The Second Coming, where he discussed how the good had no initiative these days, and only the bad did. The bad were willing to act, and the good were frightened to act. Seems that there is a change in the wind. Things are beginning to turn a little bit in the other way. As problems worsen, it seems that the bad are beginning to lose initiative a little bit, that they're beginning to wonder, and the good are beginning to become motivated. Any such motivation in America would do very well to rediscover its roots in Transcendentalism. Emerson is one of the truly inspirational authors. Thoreau also is such an author. But what is more important than the inspiration that they provide is how practical they are. There's a big flurry going on at this time because of Richard Attenborough's film about Gandhi, which is introducing all sorts of new concepts to the American public, which we have been somewhat unaware of, or at least we have ignored to a certain extent. It is very interesting that the development of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance occurred at the same time, within a few years, that Thoreau was inventing the idea for himself at Walden Pond, the idea of civil disobedience. We see that there was a double development, a development given to America and a development given to India. In India, the development took action. In America, perhaps it took root. It hasn't appeared, and yet it still lingers with us. It lurks in the corners of our unconscious. Most of us read Walden at some point, and unfortunately we normally read it because we're told to read it at school, and so we despise it instantly. But sometimes we come back to it, and many of us are affected, if not by the ideas of Thoreau, at least by the example of how much he enjoyed nature, of the amount of delight and wisdom he was able to get from a walk in the woods. That may be more important than all the practical philosophy that we can pick up from all our great idols of social philosophy, all of our Marxes and all of our Hobsons and these sort of people. It seems important that we rediscover the primal relationship that the Transcendentalists discovered with the land and with ourselves. When one is sitting alone on a mountaintop in vigil, and one isn't eating, so one isn't worried about what they're going to eat, and one isn't around other people, so they're not worried about what they're going to say or what the other person is going to say, one is just sitting on a mountaintop with trees, a little bit of water, some grass. Not only do we suddenly observe nature, but we learn a lot about ourselves. We suddenly have one companion. That's ourselves. And we have to begin to observe what we are doing. Usually the mind will leap around like a monkey through banana trees at first, all sorts of little things being gathered up and popped into the mouth. Then things quiet down a little bit. Eventually, perhaps as dusk falls or in the night, perhaps we can't sleep, we're not used to the sounds, that sort of thing. Quiet descends on us. Suddenly there are no more thoughts. Suddenly we are quiet. We're still. And when we achieve that stillness, there is the most incredible feeling of communion with what is around us, with the animals, with the trees, with the grass. There's an enormous expansion of consciousness as though we were sharing our existence with these other forms of life. Now, Any one of us, without having to sit on a mountaintop and vigil, can remember times when we have experienced that. Every one of us can remember standing somewhere, perhaps on a hill, or it can be in the middle of the city, and seeing a particularly beautiful sight. And there's that moment of stillness when you seem to somehow combine with it. You spend a moment of thought, you realize that it's not simply that you're standing and watching it, but rather that you and the sight seem to combine for a moment. There's a tremendous feeling of stillness, of life in that feeling, of communion with the world around. Now that is a legacy left to us by our Red Indian predecessors in this country, and is also a legacy left to us by our Transcendentalist predecessors. Both discovered this. Both were active believers in the importance of nature in teaching, in inspiring, in helping us to deal with an understanding of ourselves. Another aspect of this is the example of nature in a moral and in a metaphysical sense. This was also an important movement in China with Taoism. It's the same general principle as our own Indians developed, in which the Transcendentalists developed. It's been active in India also. The idea that nature is ruthless in her way of dealing with the weak. Now let's discuss for a brief moment what we mean by the weak. What is weakness? Do we mean the timid? What we mean by weak are those who become complicated. An animal who becomes weak is an animal infested with disease or with parasites. Now, isn't it true that what we do when we allow worries to eat on us, when we allow all sorts of considerations to play on us, isn't it true that we are allowing little parasites, little invisible mental parasites to feed on us? Isn't it true that we are allowing disease to infest us, a kind of mental disease? This makes us weak. And in nature, a plant or animal that is weak is destroyed. Nature is merciless about this. And in life, those of us who allow these neuroses, these small worries, these unnecessary concerns to eat on us, are also destroyed. Life becomes uglier and more limited. It's almost a feeling of being funneled down to the tip of a cone where there seems to be no way out, and we're utterly constricted. Now, how does nature overcome? Nature adjusts. Nature accepts. Nature pulls on the energy of the Mother Earth. We'll continue in a little while. I think we're going to get a little bit more practical now. We've kind of gone through some historical things, and I think we'll now try and bring the Transcendentalists up to our day and age, or down to it, depending on one's perspective. One of the big problems that we read about in our modern society is the search for identity. This became a great cliche in the 1960s when everyone was out searching for their identity. And it's interesting to note that that particular movement made a lot of use of Emerson's do your own thing, for instance, was an Emersonian idea. I think that he might not have agreed with the particular approach to it taken, but he certainly did say it. This idea of what one is, what one's place in life is of course very much involved with what one's destiny is and what one can do to help others and how one appears in the eyes of others. All of these combine to give us some sort of hint about who we are. Now, this can be a source of tremendous anxiety at different points in life. We feel the need to develop into some new field of activity or to develop some part of ourselves that we've neglected. We're not sure which way to go. We don't know which career to take or whether to back off of a new promotion or to take it. These sort of things come up repeatedly in our lives and definitely indicate cycles, changes that are coming. opportunities to grow. We tend to be very much afraid that we'll make the wrong choice, that we will take too much responsibility or not take enough, that we'll impair our growth, that we won't do the right thing to help others, that we won't find ourselves in the mode of activity which we have chosen. There are many answers to that anxiety. The one we will select to talk about right now is that of Emerson, and that is maybe the most comforting. Emerson would ask each of us to look at our lives when these moments of anxiety come up, and to think, what is it in my life that seems to be an open door? What is it that whenever I do, well, it goes well, and I always feel good about it? What is it in my life that is the entrance and the exit from the harbor? All the other ways I go, I wind up grounding myself. But this one way I can go. Emerson would say, that's the way to go. He not only will say that, but he will then justify it to you. Emerson will explain that nature has a reason for producing every single thing that she produces. The smallest rock, the smallest pebble, every human being certainly has a reason for being here. Every human being is, in some way, unique, has a particular orientation to life, a particular set of abilities, of talents, and of beliefs that develop and grow, that change. Emerson would say that every one of us is here to fulfill a specific task, that nature has created each of us to do some work which needs to be done, to unite two parts of two objects that have never been connected before, to do some sort of bridging work, to make some sort of progress happen, to make something more solid. Each of us are given particular talents, particular inclinations which can be used in that way. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone should go out and put on a loincloth and become a Gandhi. One can well imagine that if the world were composed of Gandhis, it would be a very boring place for all of them. What it means is that whatever we are most naturally disposed to, that is what we should be doing. And we should be doing it with the freedom from anxiety and the delight that nature intends for us to do it with. Whether that be running some sort of a small business or running a great corporation, whether that be a position as a government official or someone who writes books. Whatever it may be, a mother, a father, a prison guard, whatever it might be, there is some reason why we are gifted for that. I'm sure that we have all known people at some time who may do the most menial kind of labor. It might have been a janitor at school. It might have been a garbage man who came by each Thursday. And this was an extraordinary human being. It was a pleasure to be around them. And what they did was absolutely insignificant. Only later could we develop a set of dislikes around, well, my God, they haven't achieved anything, and this sort of thing. We develop these things artificially. But the fact remains that in this humble position, this person has taught. This person has taken delight. This person has brought joy and support and comfort to people simply by being there and being who they are. And these people tend to be very happy. Now, we love to point out, a millionaire or some great executive corporate leader of an international conglomerate and say, look how miserable they are, see? But the fact is that there are some who are not miserable, and this is a source of endless depression to pseudo-metaphysicians. The difference is that these people are meant to do what they are doing. They enjoy it because that is what nature intended for them to do. Their colleague, who is bright red with high blood pressure and half dead with anxiety, is not meant to be there. And if he but looked in the mirror, would immediately realize it, just by seeing how unhealthy he was. Now, one of the side effects, perhaps of transcendentalism, and definitely of American liberty, is this feeling that I can do anything that I want to do. I can go out there and be anyone I want to be. Well, that's true, legally, and politically, and socially, but it is not true essentially. We can't be whatever we want to be because we are something already. Nature has made us something already. Nature has conferred on us the abilities and the talents and the connections in life that are required for doing the task that she intends for us to discharge. The more that we fight that, the more miserable we become. The more our health goes, the less support we have around us, the less comfort. When those kind of events happen, those kind of repetitive miseries, it's time to stop and ask oneself, what is nature saying here? What am I doing wrong? So I'm certainly doing something wrong. Is it that I should be doing some other kind of work? Or is it that I have infested myself with all sorts of self-created worries? Is it that I'm out of balance, that I've become too intellectual or too emotional or too spiritual, if there can be such a thing, but we certainly know, living in California, many people we would call too spiritual. We have to examine ourselves, take stock, find out nature's perspective on us. How does the greater world see us? Some of us are overly critical of ourselves. Others are far too lenient on ourselves. But this is the way we are, and it can be quite useful for one's particular bent of personality to be either. But every once in a while, it's important to step back and let nature tell you. Now, if one does not let nature have her voice, we can all attest to this, nature will definitely get our attention. And if she has to kill us to do it, she will. Nature has both a tremendous sense of humor and no mercy. Now, the Transcendentalists would say that the body dies, the soul lives on forever. Emerson was a great believer in the immortality of the soul. I wouldn't say that he was a believer. He had absolutely no doubt. Reminds us of a story about Jung, who was asked when he was something like 89 years old, Dr. Jung, do you believe in God? There was a great long pause, and Jung stared into the camera with his hoary, sage-like look, and he said, "No, I don't believe. I know." Now, Emerson had that kind of conviction. He'd been there. He hadn't read it in books. He'd had these experiences. Now, using his perspective, nature kills us off, gleefully rather, invests us with some sort of a disease or gets us into some sort of an accident or some sort of a situation. And we can well imagine the effect on the soul, which is suddenly stunned by this turn of events, and wherever it happens to be, starts thinking to itself, must have done something wrong for that to have happened. And the lesson is slowly learned. And nature is quite patient. She will grind us down for centuries, if need be, to teach us a particular lesson. There's a lot of humor among those who believe in reincarnation when consideration of relationships between people who just don't get along. I can't stand that person. Maybe they're married, in fact. Well, the typical belief in reincarnation will say, next time around, father and son. And next time after that, twins, until suddenly you will definitely learn how to live with that person. Someone once said that God was the first humorist. It's a very apt way of looking at things. I hope that what is coming across is optimism, is positivity. I hope that the breath of what the Transcendentalists believed, the very air that they breathed, which was a positive air, which was a happy air. These were not people who had blissful lives. These were people who suffered like all of us, who had diseases. Emerson suffered terrible, terrible hurt from deaths that would reoccur. His brother, whom he adored, died. His wife died. He was constantly hurt by turn of events, by fate, if one would call it that. And yet this never affected that belief. If anything, it strengthened it. It became a goad for him to go deeper and deeper into himself and to discover these truths. Some of these figures lived very limited, unpopular lives. Some were frustrated because they could not get across their message. Others were very lonely, and yet all shared that conviction. Now, to all of them, it was a peculiarly American kind of conviction. They took great delight that these same philosophies were present in India, and were present in China, and were present everywhere in the world. And yet they felt that their approach to it was somehow American. There may be some truth to that. The Hindu scriptures have been for almost 100 years now in translation here, and they are certainly having impact. Many people read them, and yet we certainly can't say that they have had this tremendous impact. There have been translations of Plato now for over 400 years in the English language, and yet very few of us know Platonists. Platonists are a very rare breed. In fact, most who profess to be Platonists are rather teachers of Platonism, which is quite different. Perhaps this is because, like our Red Indian predecessors, we have picked up a certain impatience with these systems. Perhaps we don't have the patience to sit down and read what Plato had to say, what Aristotle had to say, and read every single word and systematize it and come to understand it and digest it and then be able to live by it, and probably discover that we have to change it a little bit to make it work for us, that this was the experience of one individual, was not the absolute gospel. We don't seem to have much patience for that sort of thing. Americans are famous the world throughout for having the most liberal interpretations of the Bible imaginable. You name it, you can justify it in the Bible if you're an American. What moves us, though? Emerson moved us. Thoreau still moves us. These writers pop up. They continually reoccur to us. Why is that? I suggest it is because when you pick up Emerson, you can read a single page. You can read a page of Thoreau and be refreshed and discover a new perspective on life and feel better. And then you can put the book down. And you don't have to pick it up again. And what's even better is that you don't feel guilty about it, because it isn't as though the author were sitting there next to you in ghostly form, shaking his head and groaning that you're not giving him all your attention. Emerson and Thoreau themselves would have told you, don't read my books. Only read them when you have to. Go out and live it. Write your own books if that's what you want to do. Now, we can learn from that. And certainly that is a very American approach to things. There's a lot of lamentation about how haphazard Americans are. We don't care about anything. We have absolutely no sense of responsibility. We're called imperialists by half of the world. The other half of the world thinks that we're insane. We're headed down the train to such. Well, the fact is that we don't tend to worry very much. Well, we turn on our televisions, we turn on our newspapers, and we become affected, and we worry, but it's a game with us. It's not as though each of us is sitting somewhere in a living room behind a desk full of books and is making plans for changing the world systematically because this is the way it has to be. We don't have patience for that sort of thing. There's a lot of question about why do we elect the individuals that we elect? One wonders, how come we don't have leaders who are trained in political science and who are trained in diplomacy and who receive 50 years of training in how to be a president of the United States? Why do we elect people who are basically just that, people? Because we don't have patience. We don't want to listen to all those systems of thought. The worst thing for us would be to have some head of a college in the presidency. It's so boring. Now that can be put negatively, and it can be put positively. There's a lot good to be said about that, and the world could learn a lot about that kind of attitude. Because in a very real way, Americans are childlike. They're also childish. Childish is what we have to get rid of in America. Childlike is something that we all should cultivate. Where to is the question. Where to? When reading Emerson, it's sometimes quite sobering to think that this man lived before most of the things that we are so used to and spend so much time thinking about in our own lives. There were no televisions, there were no telephones, there was no threat of nuclear war, there weren't even world nations. The idea of a world war was quite unthinkable. There were no jet airplanes, there were no automobiles and freeways and industrialization and pollution and all those things that take up so much of our time. Emerson lived in what appears to us to be quite a wonderland, unspoiled wilderness. And yet, there were many things happening at that time that were, to them, every bit as serious problems. The fight against slavery, the war against the Indians, great massacres of them, battles between the states were taking place at that time. There were great concerns, as there are in every age. But we can wonder, what did Emerson see for the future? Emerson did see industrialization. He did understand. He was not an idealistic fool. He thought he knew what was going to come about, and it scared him a little bit. He, in some ways, wrote against it. One sometimes has the feeling in reading him that he is throwing his book into the water, like Prospero in The Tempest, but that he hopes that one day someone will come and retrieve it, and that person will be similar in spirit to him. He writes about, as he puts it, the children of the gods who mumble to each other across the centuries, Plato, Plotinus, Bamey, who have no contemporaries who, even in the vaguest sense, understand what they're talking about, and yet who understand each other and who are companions to each other through these written words. And perhaps the reason that Emerson wrote as much as he did in spite of his injunction against it was just that he wished to preserve a message, that he wished to state in a way that would not be lost, I was here and this is what I believed. And if you believe likewise, know that I also agree. Emerson's vision of the future was basically positive. It had to be. He believed that there was a purpose for all things. He believed that God was present in all things, everywhere. He believed that the essential goodness of mankind would come out, that the confusion that we were all suffering now was a phase, that we would throw off great problems, we would cure them. Now we might suggest that this optimism had underneath it the Hindu, Platonist, Transcendentalist idea that even if we did manage to wipe ourselves out, we would still survive. Being immortal souls, we were allowed all sorts of lovely errors. It's almost as though we were given a nice uninhabited corner of the universe to mess up as much as we want until we learn our lessons. But what can we say about the future and about our own part in it, looking at our tradition as Americans, our tradition in the Transcendentalists, the tradition of our lands? What kind of responsibilities fall on our shoulders and how do we deal with them? When one considers the problems that humanity faces at this time, it's a very sobering and belittling kind of a relationship. Until one begins to think up a strategy for dealing with the situation. The strategy has been with us in every culture since the beginning of time. It's one of the simplest, most popular philosophies. And it's always forgotten because it's so obvious. How does one deal with it? Well, one does not go out and begin to cause things to happen. This isn't the way it's done. This only creates more chaos. Confucius perhaps stated it the best when he suggested that one good person is an example to that person's family. And then the family turns, and the family becomes an example to the neighborhood. And then the neighborhood turns, and the neighborhood becomes an example to the town. And the town turns and becomes an example to the province, and the province turns and becomes an example to the country, and the country turns and becomes an example to the world. That is the strategy, and it's a very simple one. And the beauty of it is so excruciatingly simple. And the other beauty of it is that it demands only one thing from each of us, and that is that we work on ourselves with patience. Patience is the key to this strategy. Because while all the chaos bubbles around us, we have patience to wait. And our children have patience to wait. And if that first neighborhood requires 100 years before it changes, it will change, because that is the inevitable law of things. Constancy is rewarded in that way. The great venerable patriarch of the family affects the grandchild, even if the children, his own children, are unaffected. And the grandchild perhaps marries into a family that is already so affected. And then the children continue it. And over the long progression, the change comes. Now, if we happen to believe with the idealistic philosophers of all the nations in such things as reincarnation, which were accepted by Plato, accepted by the Sufis, accepted by the Hindus, accepted by the Chinese, etc., etc., if we believe in that, then we also believe that we will be here again to take part in that great chain of causation, in that great change. So we can even have that delight, that idea, that not only will we be contributing in a very stoic sense, in the sense that we will do our best and then we are gone, but we may also have hope that we will be here again to see what has been wrought. How do we approach that is what we come down to. And again, we find all sorts of suggestions in the Transcendentalist writings. How do we approach this change? Well, part of it has to do with something that in modern metaphysics is usually neglected. Perhaps because of the importance of science and the general disregard for it and its results that idealists foster, the idea of clear thinking has been rejected. The idea is that you feel what you're supposed to do and this sort of thing. It's very important. It's true. One must feel what they're supposed to do. But one must also think clearly. One must be able to be sure, as Emerson put it, that both the heart and the mind approve an action. It is not enough that the heart alone approves it and the mind says no, or that the mind approves it and the heart says no. They both must say, yes, we approve. Go ahead with this action. The benefit of clear thought is that it enables us to look at ourselves. Thought is dangerous when it's used too much, and it's dangerous when it's used too little. When it's used too much, it tends to try to systematize and cut everything up in front of it, and it says to you, where is the soul? I don't see it. There's a lovely story about someone who was a coroner and said, I've cut up hundreds of bodies and I've never seen the soul. That wasn't a joke. The man was quite serious about that. That is thought working overtime, where it shouldn't be. It's something like trying to draw a circle with a square or a square with a compass. It doesn't work. The tool wasn't made for that. We were given another tool to tell us about these eternal verities. And that tool is the heart. But in the same vein, the heart is not made to tell us how to deal with particular instances. The heart can give us a little bit of a hint, which we can blissfully misinterpret. The mind, however, is equipped to tell us what to do in those cases. And it's the mind that we have to listen to verify what the heart has to say. Now, this sounds like some sort of a great, strange approach. It's much simpler than you think. Everyone does this to a certain extent. It simply means that when one is faced by a decision, a problem, nervousness, any small thing, that one pauses for a moment, one becomes quiet, very still, and perhaps the first thing that you do, depending on your own personal inclination, is you try and feel, what do I feel like I should do here? And you have a feeling. And then the mind walks in, and you use the mind. You say, now, was this an honest feeling, or was this something else talking? Was this my desire to aggrandize myself, or was this really a need to serve? Was this my desire to become a success in life, or was this my desire to be a better person? The mind reports the motive is good. Then we ask the mind, how do we approach this? And the mind reports to us, this is the way to go. And then the heart says, we can live with this. It takes a moment, just a moment or two, to be silent and to listen to ourselves. And it works. It works. It changes one's life. There is a transformation. And those of us who read persons like Emerson and who are awed that such thought could flow forth so freely from an individual should keep in mind some words that Margaret Fuller, his friend, spoke, which were simply this, that if persons would learn to listen to their hearts and their minds. Genius would be as common in this world as light. I'll take some questions now.
I kind of strained my brain this morning thinking about transcendentalism. I know what the word transcend means, but when it came to transcendentalism, I had a little problem. I gather it's intuition and pure reason applied to principles.
Mm-hmm.
And the principles have to be applied to be of any use.
Mm-hmm.
Is it inductive reason or deductive?
There might be a bent toward the inductive, but I think that both are certainly called for. It's the idea that one checks the other. Now, the important thing about the transcendentalism is that the reasoning uses the intuition, it leaps. It isn't a scientific reasoning. It's not the idea of scientific method where every single thing is carefully defined and it operates in a certain fashion and the method is carefully laid out. Rather, it's the idea that we recognize the steps in the logic as we leap them, rather than slowly inducting each and every step. There's a tendency in the thought of persons like Emerson to jump steps. Instead of taking 12, to take 3 and wind up in the same place. And I think the idea is that the intuition supports the fact that this has worked. It's the idea, an analytic kind of a philosophical mind reads Emerson and is truly annoyed by it. There's this feeling of, well, how can he say this? There's no explanation here. But the intuitive reader needs no explanation. The truth of the phrase rings immediately. The context of the phrase, the understanding which the author intended to convey, immediately tells us that this is true. And this tends to be a very trustworthy approach. Certainly a wider use of what has been given us than limitation to one or the other.
Thank you.
Bearing in mind the importance of the Eastern influence, which you refer to as Hindu strain of thought. When we hear that, are we to think in terms of the germinating source of that, Buddha?
No, well...
And if not, or if so, how would you give maybe a brief outline for people who are interested in finding the sources?
Basically, there were two principal sources that were important to Emerson. One was Buddhist, but to a much lesser extent. At that time, Buddhism was not as widespread in translation as it is now. In fact, I don't think it was until about 1900, which was after the time of the Transcendentalists, that the first really important translation of Buddhism came out in America. There were little bits and pieces of things, and these were enough to inspire. Emerson had read Schopenhauer deeply, and Schopenhauer had reconstructed Buddhism, basically, from his reading of Kant. It's quite electrifying to realize that from a few sentences of Buddhism, this man created a whole system that is virtually the same thing presented in a Western fashion. Schopenhauer was an influence on Emerson, not a particularly important one, but certainly was read and considered. Perhaps the most important Hindu influence was that of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. Those two holy scriptures were read by Emerson. Thoreau considered them to be superior to any other text. He considered the Bible and all of modern literature to pale in significance before the Bhagavad Gita. Emerson was not quite so taken. He loved these scriptures also and found an endless source of inspiration in them. But he was more likely to balance all scriptures against each other. All of the Transcendentalists were involved in translating and promulgating Hindu ideas. They felt that they were very important to the future of the country and just to general understanding. It's an interesting point to add that, fortunately, Emerson didn't have access to the information, but now that we're beginning to turn out some very thorough studies of our own native Indian cultures, we're discovering that the Central American and the North American Indian philosophies were in many ways virtually identical with the Hindu. And it's an interesting point that there's an argument about exactly which mountain it is, if I understand, but either Taos Sacred Mountain or the city of Santa Fe is supposed to be on the globe at the exact opposite point of the Holy Mountain in Tibet. And it is indeed strange that the Hopi Indians look very Tibetan, unlike their neighbors, and that their philosophy is virtually the same thing as the Tibetan, presented in a different way. The principles are exactly the same. It is a nice thing to think about how excited Emerson would have been to discover that. I think it would have opened up a whole new avenue for him in his discussion of what is true.
You like to define the transcendentalist regards to truth as absolute and relative?
That's a very good question. Well, I'll give you an answer that will at first sound absurd and then explain it. I would say both. And I would say that relative truth is the development to absolute truth. No transcendentalist would say that he had an understanding of absolute truth, that there was this absolute truth that he could envision and he was aiming himself at that. He would say that the highest vision of truth that he could conceive of was relative, but it was certainly on the way to a vision of absolute truth. But that there was somewhere an absolute, they certainly would have agreed. And that absolute, however, would not be simply truth, but as in Platonic tradition, it would be truth, beauty, love, joy, all of these things combined. Somehow these should be considered not as the primary. It's not that this is the pinnacle of beauty and love and truth that we're discussing. Rather, it's that we're discussing whatever is the fountain of what we would call absolute beauty, truth, goodness, these eternal principles. In this sense, the Transcendentalists come close to the Buddhist idea, which is often misinterpreted. Buddhists are often called atheists because they do not postulate the existence of a God. However, actually what is happening in the pure Buddhist literature is that any discussion of God is considered to be absolutely a waste of breath. And the idea is that each individual must develop their own relationship to some vision of ultimate Godhead, which will develop as their practice continues in meditation and such. And finally, that whatever God is, to the Buddhist and to the Neoplatonist, God is above being itself. Therefore, it is absolutely impossible for us to imagine what God is, and it is a source of abstraction and confusion to us and nothing more. That's really what Buddhist atheism is, more or less the idea that one day you will find out, but this isn't the time. Right now, work on yourself. Transcendentalists had somewhat a similar idea to this, except that they would have stressed that there was a connection between you and God, that there was no line, there wasn't a body and a soul and a spirit and several bodies, that rather there was this melting, this fusion of all creatures, and that there was a great connection between the ultimate reality and the basis aspect of what we call reality. And that it is the blessing of humanity, that humanity is able to rise as high as their desire and their ability can take them.
Is there now, or has there ever been any neo-transcendentalist movements, or how is that ever at all today?
Not really. There have been at Harvard University, the philosophy department is in Emerson Hall, and they do have an Emerson professor who is an expert. And, however, it's hard to pin down whether there has been a formal continuation. Certainly no one has called themselves neo-transcendentalist. But we can look at certain individuals in American culture and point to them and say, this is definitely a person who has been influenced. Manly Hall has certainly been influenced by Emerson. There are many other philosophers who are of an idealistic bent who have been influenced by Emerson. It's surprising how often we read in bibliographies of very important philosophical works that are idealistic. Emerson, it seems as though he's continually gone back to by modern philosophers who are searching for some sort of a new approach to philosophy. In that sense, his influence is much more personal than systematic. And it's interesting that Emerson himself and Thoreau, these people have somehow risen in our memories apart from their movement. Transcendentalism has tended to be forgotten. Emerson and Thoreau have survived, and very few people even know that Emerson and Thoreau had connection. They know who these people were, but that there was a movement wasn't so clear. And this may be poetic justice. It may be a good thing. Rather than the movement being enshrined as a historical relic, the individuals have become important figures in the American memory and American consciousness. And they represent examples to us. A movement is a very hard thing to identify with, and a movement is a very hard thing to learn lessons about life from. It's the idea of going to a person and asking them how to meet a certain situation, and they tell you, well, it says right here in this book that this is what you should do, and it's not very convincing. You'd rather hear, I have had this experience, this is what I did, and it worked. And in reading Emerson and reading Thoreau, that is exactly what we are doing. Each of us who reads them and who is in some way affected continues this chain of individuals who influence each other. I have had conversations with people who, in conditions at work, will say, oh, I was a manager in my particular job, and everyone who worked for me despised me, and then I started to read Emerson's essay on self-reliance, and I started to apply some of it, and I got ill, and all of a sudden they were all visiting me, and they all loved me, and they were sorry to see me go, and this sort of thing. And these kind of testimonials happen a lot, and the effect of them is that the person who hears it begins to think, I would like to see what Emerson has to say, or maybe even better, they take the example of the person they have talked to, a living example. In that way, Emerson tends to be very personal, and to lecture about Emerson, it must be said, is a very strange experience, in that one finds that one must present one's own experience with Emerson, that one can't discuss a part of Emerson that one hasn't experienced because it just doesn't make sense. There's no way of explaining it in a lecture format unless you have also felt those things. If you have, then it almost sounds as though you are not discussing him. And indeed, I promise you that if I were to stand here and speak to you simply about it and you went back to Emerson, you would probably think that I had been talking to you about Emerson all the time, and I may have been talking to you about Hindu philosophy or something else, because in truth, these agree. It is an endless source of delight to find that in every country we go to, and every scripture from every time, the same thing is being said over and over again. There are variations in presentation, there are different words, there are mistranslations, but over and over again we are being told the same truths, and they are simply this. The world is good. Be positive in what you do, knowing that. There is God. You are an immortal soul, and what is real about you is not what decays and leaves, but is the essence that is unchanging and is present to every moment. These are the truths that reappear consistently in Scripture. And maybe the most important of all, that effort, that moral labor will be rewarded and is rewarded. That being a good person is worthwhile not only in itself, but is part of a greater progression and is rewarded by the growth that it involves. I will leave you with a wonderful Islamic proverb about that, which is, he who takes one step toward God, God takes 7 steps toward him. Thank you.